Hey there, I'm Osman Faruqi, host of The Drop, a weekly culture show from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Every episode, I'll be breaking down the latest in the world of TV, film, music and pop culture, with the help of some of the best writers and critics in the country. Sometimes we go deep.
There's a thrill in seeing what's meant to be private out publicly.
But mostly, we have fun.
I love her asking Logan for a selfie and saying, congrats on the deal, ka-ching!
And there's never been a better time to start listening to The Drop. Right now, we're breaking down every episode of the final season of Succession. Follow The Drop with me, Osman Faruqi, in your favourite podcast app.
I give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the bill be now read a second time.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I am Tory Maguire and it is Wednesday, May 10.
Mr. Speaker, the budget we present to the Australian people tonight provides cost of living relief that is responsible and affordable and prioritises those most in need.
Last night, Treasurer Jim Chalmers handed down the Labor government's second federal budget. While it forecast a $4 billion surplus, the first surplus in 15 years, it also laid bare the challenges the economy is facing, both here and globally.
Mr. Speaker, the global economy is slowing due to persistent inflation, higher interest rates and financial sector strains.
There is a cost of living crisis, persisting high inflation, and to top it all off, the country faces a per capita recession in the coming year.
Outside of the pandemic and the global financial crisis, the next 2 years are expected to be the weakest for global growth in over 2 decades.
So what will the budget do to ease the economic pressures? Who will it help? And what can it tell us about Labor's priorities? Today, Chief Political Correspondent David Crowe and Senior Economics Correspondent Shane Wright join me to discuss the surplus, the winners and the losers of this year's federal budget. Welcome, David and Shane.
Hello, Tory.
It's like we've got the band back together, but
in stereo.
Our cupboard has been upgraded. This is quite a fancy cupboard in the press gallery.
Oh, look, I think drummers would love the sound acoustics in this cupboard. Come on.
So I wanted to start by telling the listeners about a funny moment this afternoon in the federal budget lockup in the press gallery in Parliament House when the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, came into our office to talk to you and other journalists about what he was up to. And in response to a question about whether Labor had wrestled the coalition's best economic manager's mantle from them, he got very energised and said that it was a life's mission thing, which I took to mean being a good economic manager was a life's mission. But then, David, you got him to clarify that really it was more about just winning the mantle and the message.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that with a $4.2 billion surplus, they now believe that they are the better economic managers. I mean, let's face it, they would believe that from times past anyway. Jim Chalmers was in the Treasury office when Labor were in power during the global financial crisis, and they've always pointed to that as proof that they can see Australia through tough times. But now they've got a surplus, the first surplus since 2008, the first Labor surplus since 1989, and they can use that to clobber the other side over economic management. And I think it's worth pointing out that they do it in an environment where we know from our Resolve political monitor, voters are very comfortable with this government. Voters actually consider Albanese and Labor to be better economic managers than Dutton and the coalition. But now there's a surplus that they can point to ram that home.
There's a big black number.
Yeah.
Like it is like the footballer who's getting the cheap shots from the opponent and they just point to the scoreboard and say, have a look at that. That's the $4.2 billion up on the scoreboard that Chalmers and Albanese and Gallagher are going to keep pointing to.
So how much credit, Shane, does Jim Chalmers deserve for this surplus? Because the opposition's argument is that a drover's dog could have delivered a surplus, which they have repeated ad nauseum for the last 2 days.
I know.
But is that true?
Well, for poor old drover's dogs, it was Bill Hayden who used that term when he was rolled as leader of the Labor Party on the same day that Malcolm Fraser called the 1983 election and said, yeah, anyone could lead this party to an electoral victory. And Bob Hawke stayed in power for another 9 years. So, yeah, the drover's dog had a pretty good run of it back then. This time around, look, some of it is definitely due to the decisions of Chalmers and Gallagher. So they can claim, like, remember the brouhaha during the election last year when Albanese got up and said, yep, everyone should get a pay rise in line with inflation. People were pinning their dresses in concern about what this meant. Higher wages translates into more tax revenue, and they've picked that up through a stronger jobs workforce. Commodity prices, that's out of their control. Thanks, Vladimir Putin, for what you've done to commodity prices around the way. Thank you to the Chinese Communist Party for what you're doing around continuing to drag in Australian iron ore at a really high price. So that's outside his control. So there's maybe 60-40 or 40-60, depending on which way you look at it. The budget was going to improve. That was always going to happen. But it is the decisions they've made since coming to office. And the biggest one, of course, is the Lamington, as we call it, the low middle income tax offset. There was pressure internally to do something because this is a $12 billion a year policy which was due to end, has ended, and they've stuck to their guns, said, no, we're going to do it. There's your difference between that surplus and not. Okay,
so let's get into what Jim Chalmers did decide to do with the little bit of breathing space that this greater tax take has given him. It is relatively modest, and there are going to be people, including our colleague Ross Gittins, who thinks that he's wasted an opportunity to actually make bigger increases in welfare and spend more money in health and education. But, David, what has he actually decided to spend the money on?
More than a dozen initiatives which, in the government's own brochure, because they issue a brochure as well as the formal budget papers, add up to $24 billion in various spending initiatives over 5 years. The real headline there is $5.7 billion for Medicare.
Speaker, one of the things that makes this the best country in the world is our shared belief that every Australian should be able to access affordable, reliable healthcare.
And that is aimed at lowering the cost of going to the doctor for a lot of people. Anybody under 16 should get bulk billing. Commonwealth concession card holders should also get bulk billing.
Our Labor government will triple the bulk billing incentive.
It triples the incentives for GPs to offer bulk billing.
This is the biggest increase to the incentive ever, delivering a $3.5
Now, I always thought that they would go with Medicare because it's an iconic Labor policy. They believe it's their legacy to Australia, and they've been saying for quite some time now that it's in the worst state it's been in for 40 years. So, given that rhetoric, they've put $5.7 billion in.
And it will ensure that for millions of people, the quality of your health care is guaranteed, not by your credit card, but by your Medicare card.
But there's also more money for Commonwealth rent assistance, $2.7 billion. The upside surprise, I think, in the welfare space is that there's a $40 per fortnight increase in JobSeeker and other allowances like youth allowance and Austudy. That will come in September. Interestingly, at around the same time, there'll be an indexation increase. So people who are out of work and need that income support, they've done fairly well. It's not as big an increase as the government's own advisory panel told them to do, but this is what they decided was affordable. So all up, there are a whole bunch of new spending initiatives. The big question is, does that drive up inflation? Are they being too generous? And I think this is where the debate is going to go. But when Shane and I were talking to the Treasury experts inside the lockup, and we can all see how this debate's going to go, the key point is the spending increase on all these measures over the next financial year is $3.6 billion. And the view within the government is that that is not enough to move the dial and say, leave the RBA with no option but to increase interest rates because inflation's going to be higher. The forecast in this budget is that the measures in total will drive down inflation. and a lot's going to ride on that forecast.
And is that not just because the figure itself is not huge, but because where they've targeted it? I mean, if people are not taking their kid to the doctor because they can't get a bulk billing appointment, making that available is not going to then make them splash the cash on other things, right?
Yeah, inflation doesn't really affect whether you're about to keel over with some exotic disease or not. So that's part of it. And we go back to, say, last year where Josh Frydenberg announced it was $8.8 billion went out the door between March and the end of the financial year. And then there was another 17 bill, of which the biggest was the Lamington, which came soon after. And the argument put to us is, right, compare that. And Treasury at the time said that $8.8 billion, well, it probably won't affect inflation. It clearly did.
Just a reminder note, that included that cut in fuel excise.
Yes.
For all those motorists, revenue that was just basically gone. For over that 6-month period.
That's right. So that went out, and then you go, right, and we've got $3.6 billion over 12 months. It's not starting till September. And you go, right, is that enough? If $8.8 billion Treasury thought wasn't, 3.6 clearly can't. And then you look at all the other spending and you go, well, some of it is, say, and this goes back to some of the programs that were not funded. So the My Health program, or the digital My Health program, it gets $700 million to keep going. You cannot argue with a straight face that's inflationary. Or the extra money coming back to the Brisbane Olympics. They've had to put in $1 billion to make sure that the Brisbane Games gets underway. And that's not in for another 2 or 3 years. You can't say, well, that's inflationary now. You've got to look a bit more carefully at these figures.
But what we do know is that is exactly where the coalition's going to go with their attack, because the sort of the weight of the money will give the coalition some fairly predictable attack lines saying you're spending too much and it's your fault when inflation stays up. And the key forecast is that inflation, which we all know right now is soaring. We're seeing the higher prices everywhere at the supermarket, 7% in the March quarter. They are predicting inflation will be 3.25% in the June quarter of 2024. If they don't achieve that forecast, they are in for a world of political pain next year and then going into the next election.
Which gets us to a really interesting point, two interesting points. The first one is they are forecasting inflation lower than the Reserve Bank right now, based on this. The biggest issue, though, is that what happens July 1 next year? The Stage 3 tax cuts come in. Both sides are agreeing to that. So Peter Dutton has to make a decision. How do you attack that? Because the tax cuts in their first year are worth $20 billion. They dwarf the new spending that's in this budget in 1 year by a mile.
Yeah.
And yet the economy, and I think some of the critics have ignored the fact that the economy is slowing. This budget predicts a per capita recession in the next 12 to 18 months' time. And that's largely due to households just not having enough money to spend. They're really going to wind back, and this goes to what I've been saying. So somewhere along the line, you've got all this money coming in, inflation's falling, and you've got to try and mount an argument that this budget is somehow inflationary, and I don't think you get there.
Okay, I've got 2 questions on what you just said. The first one is, what is a per capita recession?
Right, so the economy is going to keep growing, but the number of people in the country is growing faster than the economy. So think of our economic pie. The economic pie is getting bigger, but your share of that pie you have to share with more people, so it's getting smaller. That's the per capita recession.
The second question is, how can Treasury have different assumptions about inflation to the Reserve Bank?
Well, the key one is because of the policy that they've got in place around energy. So the RBA could not forecast completely accurately. They have a real good idea what's coming. The other thing, there is a bit of a difference of opinion between the Reserve Bank and Treasury. Treasury doesn't think services inflation is going to stay as sticky as the Reserve Bank is. Now, the Reserve Bank's been bitten over the last 18 months about their forecasts on inflation, so they're a bit more worried about, it's going to hang around a bit longer. They could be right. Treasury could be wrong.
Isn't the answer to Tory's question that economists can never agree on a forecast?
On the one hand and then on the other. Yeah.
And I do know that all of the listeners of Please Explain would be looking for that straight line between the predicted inflation in this budget dropping quite significantly next year and interest rates.
That's right.
Exactly.
And
this is meant to be a budget that tackles inflation and eases that pressure on interest rates and helps the RBA moderate those increases in interest rates over time and get back to normal rates. I mean, that's the objective here. Everything depends for the government on whether it achieves that. And it's got to hope that the RBA takes the signal from this budget on interest rates.
Okay. I just want to talk about income tax because we're going to spend the next 12 months leading up to the next budget arguing about the stage 3 tax cuts, which are due to come in on July 1 next year. This year, the federal budget has brought in $300 billion in income tax. Is this a historic high?
Oh,
Shane?
yeah. It's a mountain we keep on climbing. We're the Edmund Hillarys of tax. But, and it's actually a good sign that the economy's still growing, and it's a sign that there's really solid jobs growth and solid wages growth. So, there's a hell of a lot of personal income tax, and it remains the single biggest tax that's collected by the government.
The Treasurer really wanted to move on very quickly when you asked him in the lockup if he was presiding over the highest tax in government since John Howard and Peter Costello in the early 2000s.
Well, if they axe the stage 3, that's what will happen to them. And Crowe and I are old enough and silly enough to remember Labor under Wayne Swan when he was Treasurer and Shadow Treasurer hounding Howard and Costello saying, you are the highest taxing government on record. And they were, and they still are. If you don't go through with stage 3, well, we've got a new winner on the mantelpiece, and that's Albanese and Chalmers.
Yeah, okay.
The stage 3 debate, I think, changes a little bit after this budget because with a surplus in sight, decisions have to be made about whether to cut spending or change revenue in order to improve the budget bottom line. And there are some new numbers. I mean, inside the lockup, you get to talk to Treasury officials, you get to go to a press conference, numbers emerge and then you double check them. And the new numbers are that the stage 3 tax cuts will cost $69 billion over the next 4 years. That's a new number. It's bigger than previously expected. And that includes a figure of $21.5 billion just in the first year of those tax cuts. So the argument about whether to be generous enough with those stage 3 tax cuts now comes down to, well, could you have a surplus if you didn't have those tax cuts? Then, of course, you've got an argument that you're taxing Australians too much. And bear in mind, those stage 3 tax cuts go to people on, $46,000 and more. So a lot of people would get those tax cuts. Obviously, they're more generous to people at the top end because those people pay more tax, have a higher income. But we just know this debate will not go away. Jim Chalmers knows that it won't go away as well. And I think it'll be one of those big questions for Labor at the next election. Do they go to the next election with a different plan for income tax?
Okay. So as we wrap up, can I ask both of you, I'm not going to make it, a score out of 10, but your overall view of Jim Chalmers' second budget as Treasurer?
I think it's an extremely good budget. It spends money on essential services like Medicare. It addresses this issue of helping the most vulnerable, like the single mothers. And it's got a surplus of $4.2 billion with, I think, another surplus in sight next year. I mean, that's a better outlook than we've been accustomed to for many years now. So I think on those grounds, it rates pretty well.
Solid. There's still some holes in it. Like, for instance, there's an assumption about how much they save on the NDIS, which is the fastest growing part of the budget. So it is, we're going to save money, but no explanation how. There are some issues, and this is the way that Albanese and Chalmers and Gallagher have been looking at this. Like, you don't see them in isolation. So there's some stuff on housing, for instance, which is perhaps the biggest issue in the economy. There's building on elements that were established in the last budget, and there are going to be more things coming in the next 6 to 9 months. So it's a solid step, but we've still got a long way on this trek.
It might make people feel just a little bit calmer because it's a budget that's quite easy to understand.
Yeah, I don't think it rocks the boat. And I think that's something that Albanese, as Prime Minister, has been so consciously doing since the election. He's not startling people. And he knows he's got time because given the way the Liberals are at the moment, the government feels that they've got a pretty good chance at a second term.
Well, fellas, thank you so much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Tory.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by our executive producer Ruby Schwartz with technical assistance from Debbie Harrington. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It is the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Tory Maguire. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.